In the genre of lettering, there are a couple of fundamental skills one needs to learn, and perhaps one of the most essential and most useful skills is learning how to draw letters in 3 dimensions. Now, learning how to make letters in 3 dimensions is a skill that will enhance your hand lettering skills overall, but understanding also how to form letters in 3 dimensions is a great addition to your lettering and gives you a little bit more variety in terms of interesting text qualities that you compare with other styles of text. With that being said, in today's tutorial we will be learning exactly that and going through the alphabet and looking at how we can kind of give 3 dimensions to various letters. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org where we explore various art related topics, and in today's tutorial we will be covering perhaps one of the most essential hand lettering topics, and that is how to draw letters in 3 dimensions. Now that we know what we're in for, let's get into it. Now we're going to just be working with a set of simple tools, so you can just use some paper, a pencil, maybe use a pen to kind of emphasize the 3-dimensional qualities within your various letters. But before that, what we're going to do is we're going to break down some key concepts to kind of help us understand what to know before drawing 3D letters. So there are a few key concepts that we obviously want to be acquainted with, and when creating 3D lettering, this means we need to really understand how 3 dimensions work. Basically what we are doing are turning letters into 3-dimensional objects. So to understand how 3 dimensions work and how they are applied to lettering, let us look at these very fundamental concepts that will help us within our 3D lettering establishment. The first thing we want to break down is perspective. So the 3 dimensions, the perspective that we will define is obviously defined by these 3 dimensions. So the 3 dimensions and form from which direction the letter is being viewed is basically what we mean by perspective. This means if we are looking at the letter from a left point perspective or from the left side, we will see the dimensions on the left side of that lettering naturally. And obviously this can apply to whatever type of direction we are viewing the lettering from, because now we are viewing it as a 3-dimensional object. So we are either seeing it from the top view, side view, whether it's left or right, or the bottom view. But basically that concept applies to all angles depending on how you are drawing your 3D letters. Now the next thing we want to break down are the actual 3 dimensions. In the case of understanding 3 dimensions, we are working with height, length and depth. So these are the 3 different dimensions that make 3D lettering or any type of 3-dimensional objects 3-dimensional. That's because they move in a height or an upward direction, they move sideways, and they have depth to them, which kind of defines this quality of back and forward movement. Now, once you understand this idea of establishing this quality of a 3-dimensional structure being able to move in these various directions, so in a forward direction, upward direction, and a sideways direction, what we are establishing are obviously these various 3 dimensions, but the way in which we can distinguish them is through the use of various tonal values. In this way, we kind of create these 3 different tonal values on these 3 different surface areas or dimensions. So when adding dimensions to letters, we want to also define the dimensions with shading, and that's how we kind of establish tonal value through the process of shading. We can do this by imagining that the parts of the letter that are the lightest would be parts of the letter that are the most exposed to a light source. And this is where this concept of a light source is really essential to this idea of creating any sort of 3-dimensional object. You can't really define 3 dimensions in a drawing format or medium unless you are aware of the fact that shading represents shadow, and shadow means that there is a light source present. And that's the way in which 3 dimensions is defined through a drawing process. So using 3 different types of shades or tonal values and taking that approach can give the letter or text a more realistic quality in terms of how it interacts with a light source. And this is just a great way to enhance the 3D lettering, giving the actual dimensions a more realistic aesthetic by incorporating a consistent light source coming from a very specific direction. Now that we understand some key and fundamental concepts associated with 3 dimensions and how to define those qualities in a drawing format, let's apply them to our actual letters. However, the way in which we can do this first is by actually creating a cube, and this way we can understand how to establish the 3 dimensions through an actual drawing process and then apply these concepts to letters. So now that we know what to expect, let's apply these concepts to a simple shape. So defining how these concepts are present within a shape will also help us to kind of prepare for applying them to a letter. So we're going to start by drawing a simple 3-dimensional cube. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to draw the shape. So let us begin by drawing a simple square, which we can begin by taking our pencil and ruler and drawing a simple square shape, making sure it's even on both the height and length side. Now the next thing we want to do is we're going to start adding in these dimensions. So from here we will choose choose a direction in which our dimension lines will go, and this will kind of establish the concept of depth within our cube drawing. So let's make the lines go in a downward direction for the sake towards the right of the page. With a square, we can already see that there is height and length, so we now want to give it depth. Once again, that is going to be the third dimension within this particular shape. So we do this by drawing a set of lines from each corner of the cube moving in the same diagonal direction in a parallel formation. From here, we can connect those lines by drawing a vertical and horizontal line that runs parallel along both the bottom of the cube and the side of the cube. And as we draw these lines, we'll find them intersecting with the diagonal lines, giving the square 3 dimensions, turning it into a cube structure. An important note to remember is that as long as the lines run parallel with each other, the 3-dimensional qualities of the shape will always be correct. So we can see that as all the depth lines run diagonally and parallel in the same direction, this will make the cube accurate in its formation. Now, this applies to all the lines that indicate height and width as well. However, the concept to kind of just remember and apply is making sure that all the lines that run in certain directions are always parallel to one another and are always the same in length. Now, using a 3 shaded rule, we're going to start applying shading to our cube, and this is going to establish the various tonal values that we apply to different surface areas within our 3-dimensional structure. Now, using a 3 shade rule, we will see how the cube becomes a bit more 3-dimensional and realistic. If we imagine the light source to be directly in front of the cube, we can imagine that it will impact the color of each side of the visible cube and its various surface areas. Using 3 tonal values such as a dark, mid-tone, and light tone, we can define the shape slightly better, and you also don't need to worry about figuring out the light source first. The idea is that basically if you work with this 3 shade rule, you're basically inherently going to form a concept of a light source coming from a particular direction depending on which side of the cube is lightest in its tonal value. This is a process of transforming a 2-dimensional shape into a 3-dimensional shape, and using this method you can transform basically any shape into 3 dimensions, including letters, simply by this concept of applying 3 different tonal values. Now we're going to start looking at drawing 3 dimensions in a letter with straight lines. So let's utilize these concepts and ideas and this drawing process and start applying it to actual letters. So the idea is that we're going to start by drawing a letter. Let's begin by taking our pencils and drawing a simple line letter, let's say a capital letter A, and we'll use the letter A to demonstrate the process because it has sharp edges. So we want to know how the process can be applied to straight letters and later on curved letters, as these types of letters obviously differ in their actual formations. Now, once we have our letter drawn in a line version, we can just basically draw this in a line version. We can proceed to apply a block letter process of outlining that lined letter. As we outline the letter, we want to keep a little gap between the outlined lines and the letter line, and by doing this we give it a larger width and body to the actual letter, giving it a blocky aesthetic. Now, once we have made a thicker letter after we have outlined the initial written letter, we can then erase the lines within the outlined lines. We should be left with a thicker letter A, capital letter A, and you do want to make sure you make the letter block styled. This is also just going to make the process of giving it dimension slightly easier, and it's just a simple way to kind of define this quality of giving the letter this 3-dimensional quality. Now what we're going to do is from here we can add dimension lines. Again, we are dealing with obviously building up the quality of depth. So when a shape is 2-dimensional, it already has height and length. Now what we are doing obviously is we are giving the shape depth, which makes it more 3-dimensional, and we can do this by drawing diagonal lines from every corner of the letter A that move toward the same direction in a parallel fashion as we did for the cube. Now let us draw these diagonal lines towards, let's say, the top right corner. From there we want to basically then connect these lines by drawing parallel lines that run along the lines that indicate the height and length within the letter itself. So naturally all those straight diagonal lines that establish the sides of the letter A, you want to create those parallel lines to give that 3-dimensional quality that connects to those lines that establish depth. And as we do this, we will intersect obviously with those other diagonal lines, which will give the letter a 3-dimensional quality, giving you a clear indication of the shape of the letter. Remember, as long as you're keeping the lines parallel, corresponding lines, so let's say the sides of the letter A are establishing height, and then the bottom of the letter is establishing length, you want to make sure those lines are running parallel to establish a sense of 3-dimensionality that connect to those lines that define depth. And then lastly, once we have completed that, we can add shading to the letter, enhancing its three-dimensional qualities. So once our letter is drawn in 3 dimensions, we can begin to add different shades to the letter. So we want to make sure that each section of the letter that faces the same direction is also the same in color. So for instance, all the right sides of the letter should be the same in tonal value. So let's say we can color in all the sides that face the right direction with our black marker, keeping that side dark, and then keeping with the 3-tone principle, we can choose which side we want to be darker or lighter. So you can play around with that, it really is up to you. But as long as you remember that all the sides of the letter that face the same direction should always be the same color or shade. Now this means that the letter is accurately interacting with light, which can enhance the 3-dimensional quality of the letter in a more realistic way. Now that is how you add dimension to a letter, turning a 2-dimensional letter into a 3-dimensional letter. 2 things to make sure you remember is that each set of dimensional lines should always run parallel to one another. Secondly, all sides of the letter that face the same direction should be the same in shade or color. Now the next thing we want to look at is drawing 3 dimensions in a letter with curved lines. So we'll now proceed to draw a new letter using the same principles. However, this time we will be drawing a letter with curves. Drawing a letter with curves changes the shading process a little bit, and this is because there are no distinct edges in some parts of the letter, meaning we must create a more seamless gradient that shifts from a dark to lighter tonal value. So once again, we start by drawing a simple curved letter. So let's begin by drawing the letter C with our pencils. We can follow the same process of giving the letter a block-like effect, which you basically draw the letter, then outline it, making it slightly thicker to give it this block letter quality. And once we have our letter C written out in pencil, we can then carry on by taking our micron marker and outlining the text. You could do this at the end of the whole process or the beginning, it doesn't really matter. However, sometimes it is nice to just do it earlier on so that you have clear guidelines to work within. So once we have done that, we can then start to once again add in dimensions. So we begin by drawing diagonal lines in a direction that we choose, and these lines will indicate the quality of depth. So the letter already exists as a 2-dimensional shape, having both width and height. We just now need to give it depth, which is the 3rd dimension, and we want to draw from the corners at the end of the letter shape first. Now these lines will also be drawn parallel as they move toward a single direction, but from there we want to add a line at the bottom of the letter, so we know that the bottom of the C shape doesn't have an edge. However, we want to draw a line from the bottom of the curve of the C, again making sure that this depth line moves towards the same direction as the other depth lines, or the lines that define depth. We also want to make sure that all depth lines, or lines that define depth, are parallel once again with one another. From here we want to add another height line to the letter. If we follow the rule of keeping each set of lines for each dimension parallel, once again we'll find that it makes the process much easier. So when we draw height lines parallel with the shape of the letter, we will find that it intersects with the depth lines quite naturally and quite seamlessly. So just make sure you draw lines parallel to one another and you will be fine. Following the parallel line rule, we will allow the lines of our letter to intersect, which will make the letter look more natural. And remember that all depth lines are parallel with one another once again, and that this rule applies to each set of lines for each dimension. So all height lines parallel, all length lines parallel, and all depth lines parallel. And then from there we can go over our letter with our markers to embolden the letter once again. And then lastly we can move on to shading the letter. So the same shading process applies to curved letters, however this time it's going to be a little bit different wherever the surface area does have a curve. So we'll still apply the same 3 tonal value rules using dark midtones and light tones for each dimension. However, this time there is a gradient from the bottom or side of the letter to the top. So this means we will make a seamless gradient that transitions from one tone to another. So once again we'll find that it is the same process and it is quite simple, but let's say the light source is above the letter. This means that the lightest tone will be on any surface, obviously facing the upward direction. You can keep all these surfaces white, however you can shade with your pencil the mid-tone for the front of the letter and a darker tone for any surface facing down. Along the curved side of the letter, however, you will shade a seamless gradient that transitions from the dark side to the light side as the letter curves from the bottom section to the top section of the letter. And this is where you can use the bottom dark feature or tone to kind of indicate how dark that bottom parts of the curve should be, and then how the lighter section or mid-tonal value near the top section of the letter should be in terms of how to kind of create that transition from dark to light. Always remember that each set of dimensional lines should always run parallel to one another, not forgetting that rule. And then secondly, all sides of the letter that face the same direction should always be the same in shade or color, even if they have a subtle curvature. But otherwise, now that we really understand how to kind of create letters, how to kind of make 3 dimensions, and how to apply this to letters that are straight edged or have curves in them, we're going to explore drawing a 3-dimensional alphabet. Now that we know the method of turning 2-dimensional letters into 3D lettering, we can kind of go through various letters and kind of play around and use this as an exercise to explore different thicknesses of letters, different directions for depth lines, and how you add the different shading tones to establish this quality of 3-dimensionality. Now, once again, the first thing to do is we begin by drawing the letters of the alphabet on a page. This can be however large you want it to be. Make sure to start by first writing out each letter in a simple line style to size them and space them nicely within your page. And we also want to make sure that we have enough room between all letters. This way we can also explore our 3D lines going in all sorts of directions and not worrying too much about how thick they are. The second thing we want to do is we're going to start adding dimensions. So since we understand how to make our letters thicker, we can do this for each letter and then apply the principles of dimension. We want to move from one letter to the next, choosing which direction we want to add depth lines to. So explore how deep you want the letters to appear, and this is an exercise that intends for you to explore and experiment. So now that you understand the process of adding dimensions to your letters, feel free to play around with adding your qualities of depth in your letters in various directions. As long as you add dimensions to each letter and slowly go through the process of applying each step to each letter, you can obviously allow them to go in various directions, sticking to the rules that you have learned within this tutorial. So rules of parallel lines and rules of tonal values being the same if they face the same direction. Once we have gone through each letter, exploring different variations of creating 3 dimensions in each letter, we can go over our letters with a marker once again to embolden the text. You don't have to do this, but when learning how to shade in 3 dimensions, it can be quite helpful for the lines to be quite distinct. Now, as you establish the 3-dimensional qualities within your letters, remember to just take your time going over each letter, especially with the curved letters. Remember, the curved letters also want to remain parallel within the curved actual line letter as you kind of thicken them. And as you also give them more depth. As you do this, remember that when we begin to shade, you can use the 3-tone rule however you please. So this means you don't need to always choose a direction for the light source. As you add in 3 different tonal values to 3 different surface area, you will inevitably just create a light source by nature of doing that. So from here, we can allow ourselves to be playful with both our markers and pencils as we shade in each letter. Remember that you can use both your pencil and marker in tandem with each other to create the 3 tonal variations within the letter. This means that the black marker would be the darkest tone, and then you can create lighter tones with your pencil. Try various sequences, such as making the face of the letter black with mid-tones along the side and lighter tones on top. Try all different variations of the 3 tones. The aim here is for you to explore variations with adding shading into your 3D lettering. But otherwise, guys, giving the letters different shading sequences will also give the letters different perspective qualities. So this is because as we add shading to each letter that is drawn in different directions, we are illuminating the letter within our shading essentially. So this makes the letter seem as if it has been lit from a particular direction or different directions, and it is a great way to see how shading basically enhances a 3-dimensional quality of a letter. Something to note about the curved letters is that you should always create seamless gradients in the curved features or surface areas of the letter parallel with the dimensional lines. So for instance, if you are shading along a diagonal axis for the depth lines, try to keep your shading diagonal. And the same goes for if you're basically shading the curved side along a kind of horizontal axis, make sure the shading remains horizontal. So this will give the shading a more accurate quality. Just make sure that the shading also runs parallel with the actual shape of the depth qualities within your letters. Most importantly, make sure you play around with how you shade in each letter, explore sequences, but also explore making letters darker or lighter. So this means you can make a range of shades from dark to light that is relatively lighter or darker altogether. So just make sure you use this exercise to experiment and explore your 3D lettering, and ultimately have fun and see how you go through various letters one at a time. But otherwise, guys, that is it for today. Some key concepts to think about during this process is make sure you use a ruler. Take your time with curved letters. Remember, creating curved sides of letters requires a more gentle and considerate approach to creating those parallel surfaces. Keeping lines parallel is also another thing that's important in terms of making sure all height lines and depth lines and lines that establish length should always be the same in terms of the direction that they flow. And then lastly, always work with 3 different tonal values to emphasize the 3-dimensional quality. But otherwise, guys, that is it for today. Thanks again for tuning in. If you did like this video or are interested in similar or related topics, please let us know in the comment section below. We are kind of exploring hand lettering topics and just how to kind of establish a basis for hand lettering, and then shifting into more complex hand lettering ideas like calligraphy and so on. So please do let us know in the comment section below what you are interested in. Otherwise, please do like the video and subscribe. Show us some love that way, which helps us to basically grow the channel, and that enables us to make more art related content for you guys. But thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.